So, Claire, are you still a failure? Or have you finally figured out what you're doing with your life? My father asked me that at his 70th birthday dinner, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. 20 relatives and family friends sat beneath the warm lights of a private dining room in Columbus, Ohio, with half-finished plates of prime rib and roasted potatoes in front of them. For a second, nobody moved. My brother Daniel stared at his wine glass. His wife, Melissa, lowered her eyes. My mother, Evelyn, pressed her napkin flat against her lap as if smoothing out one more uncomfortable moment could somehow make it disappear. Dad leaned back in his chair and waited. Richard Bennett had always been good at waiting for an answer when he already believed he knew what it would be. I was 42 years old, but under that look, I could have been 16 again, standing beside a report card that wasn't quite good enough. I set my fork beside my plate. Maybe, I said. Dad raised an eyebrow. I smiled, not because anything was funny, but because I suddenly understood that I didn't owe him the performance he was expecting. But my story isn't over yet, Dad. A few people shifted in their chairs. Daniel glanced at me, then at our father. Dad gave a short laugh. Well, that's one way to look at it. Then he reached for his coffee as if the conversation had ended exactly where he wanted it to. What he didn't know was that 3 hours earlier, an email had arrived in my inbox containing an offer that could change everything. I hadn't answered it. I hadn't told Daniel. I hadn't told Mom. And I certainly hadn't told Dad. For most of my life, that would have been impossible for me. I used to bring every small victory to my father like a child carrying home a ribbon from school. I wanted him to look at me and say the words I had spent decades waiting to hear. You did well, Claire. I'm proud of you. Instead, Richard Bennett had a way of examining good news until he found the flaw in it. When I landed my first real job after college, he asked about the salary. When I told him, he compared it with Daniel's. When I got promoted, he wanted to know why it had taken so long. When I started my first business, he asked what I would do when it failed. Years later, when it actually did fail, Dad didn't say I told you so. He didn't have to. His silence said it for him. That was Richard's talent. He rarely needed cruel words. A raised eyebrow could do the work. A pause could do even more. But tonight he had chosen the word failure, and somehow hearing it out loud made it smaller than it had been inside my head. Melissa broke the silence first. Richard, Claire's been working really hard. Dad waved one hand gently. I'm not criticizing her. I'm asking a question. That was another thing he did well. He could turn judgment into concern before anyone had time to challenge him. A person needs stability, he continued. Especially at your age, Claire. You can't keep starting over forever. Dad, Daniel said quietly. It's your birthday. Maybe we don't need to do this tonight. Dad looked almost surprised. Do what? We're family. If we can't be honest with each other, who can? I looked around the table. Family. That word had covered a lot of things in our house over the years. Advice nobody requested. Comparisons nobody admitted making. Disappointments disguised as concern. I used to fight against all of it. I would explain my plans, defend my choices, produce numbers, timelines, reasons. I thought if I could make a strong enough case, Dad would finally understand me. That night, I didn't explain anything. You're right, I said. Dad looked at me. About what? A person does need stability. He nodded, satisfied. Exactly. It just took me a while to understand what kind. Something changed in his expression, barely enough for anyone else to notice. I noticed. I had spent my whole life studying my father's face. And what kind is that? He asked. I picked up my water glass. The kind that doesn't depend on somebody else's approval. Daniel stopped moving. Mom looked directly at me for the first time since the conversation began. Dad's smile faded for half a second, then returned. Well, he said, that sounds very philosophical. I took a sip of water. Maybe. The conversation moved on. Daniel asked Dad about a golf trip. Melissa complimented the restaurant. Mom began discussing the cake. Within minutes, everyone was talking again, but something inside me had gone strangely quiet. My phone rested inside my purse beneath the table. I knew the email was still there. I knew the number written inside it. $3.2 million. 6 months earlier, Dad had called what I was building a little side project. 3 months earlier, he'd asked when I planned to get a real job. And now a company based in Chicago wanted to acquire a controlling share of that little project for more money than I had ever imagined seeing attached to my name. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something closer to relief, and not because of the money. I had finally discovered something more valuable than proving my father wrong. I no longer needed him to know he was wrong. When the cake arrived, everyone sang happy birthday. Dad smiled while Mom placed a hand on his shoulder. I sang too. I meant it. He was my father. I loved him. Love and disappointment can live in the same room for years without anyone acknowledging either one. After dinner, Dad hugged me near the restaurant entrance. "Don't take what I said personally," he murmured. "I just want to see you succeed." Once, those words would have followed me home. That night, they didn't even make it to the parking lot. "I know, Dad," I said. He squeezed my shoulder. "You'll figure it out eventually." I smiled. Maybe I already have. Then I walked toward my car through the cool October air. Behind me, I could hear my family laughing as they waited for the valet. I opened the driver's door, sat down, and finally took out my phone. The acquisition offer was still waiting. At the bottom of the email was a sentence asking for my decision by Friday. I read it twice, then locked my screen without replying. Dad thought the saddest thing I'd said all evening was that my story wasn't over yet. He had no idea those words weren't an excuse. They were a promise. By the time I was 10 years old, I already knew there were two kinds of achievements in our house: the ones my father understood and the ones that did not count. Daniel was 3 years older than me, and almost everything about him made sense to Dad. He liked rules. He liked schedules. He brought home report cards filled with high grades and lined his bedroom shelf with trophies from baseball and academic competitions. Dad never had to ask what Daniel planned to do next because Daniel always seemed to be moving towards something recognizable. College, a business degree, a respectable job, a house with a 2-car garage. I was different. I spent Saturday mornings drawing floor plans for houses that did not exist. I wrote stories in spiral notebooks and rearranged my bedroom furniture every few months because I liked discovering better ways to use the same space. When teachers asked what I wanted to become, my answer changed constantly. Dad called that lack of direction. Mom called it curiosity. I preferred Mom's version, but Dad's was the one that stayed with me. Richard Bennett believed a good life could be measured. Salary, savings, property, promotions. He had built his own career that way, starting in sales and eventually becoming a regional manager for a manufacturing company outside Columbus. He was not a cold father. That would have been easier to understand. He came to school events. He taught me how to change a tire. He checked the oil in my first car every Sunday until I learned to do it myself. If I called him at midnight with a flat tire 20 miles from home, he would have been in his car before I finished explaining where I was. But emotional approval was different. Dad gave it carefully, almost as if there were a limited supply. Daniel knew how to earn it. I never quite figured out the formula. When Daniel graduated from Ohio State University, Dad framed his diploma before Daniel even had an apartment wall to hang it on. When I graduated with a communications degree, Dad hugged me and said, "Now you need to figure out what that degree is actually worth." I laughed because everyone else did. That became a pattern. Dad would say something sharp, then smile just enough to make challenging him seem unreasonable. At 24, I accepted a marketing job with a small company in Cincinnati. I called home after my first promotion, proud of the 12% raise that came with it. Dad congratulated me, then asked what Daniel was earning. I knew he probably did not mean to ruin the moment. Somehow, that made it worse. I began measuring myself before Dad had the chance. When I bought my first used Honda Accord, I immediately explained why I had chosen a used car instead of a new one. When I moved into a better apartment, I told him the rent before he could ask. When I changed jobs, I arrived at Sunday dinner prepared with reasons, numbers, and a 5-year plan. I was not talking to my father anymore. I was presenting evidence. Daniel noticed before I did. One Thanksgiving, after Dad questioned why I had left a stable position for a smaller company, Daniel found me alone in the kitchen loading plates into the dishwasher. "You know you do not have to convince him every time," he said. I kept rinsing a plate. I am not trying to convince him. Daniel gave me the kind of look only an older brother can give. "Claire." I turned on the faucet harder than necessary. "He worries. He judges," Daniel said. "There is a difference." I defended Dad. That was the strange part. I always defended him. I said he had grown up with very little money. I said stability mattered to him because he had spent his childhood without much of it. I said questioning my decisions was simply his way of protecting me. All of those things were partly true, but a partial truth can hide a larger one for years. I wanted his approval so badly that I had learned to translate criticism into love. At 31, I got married. Dad liked my husband because he had a steady job and wore a tie to family dinners. At 34, I left corporate marketing and started a small consulting business from the spare bedroom of our townhouse. Dad hated the idea immediately. "You have health insurance now," he reminded me. "You have a retirement plan. Why gamble with that?" I told him I was not gambling. I had clients lined up. I had savings. I had spent almost a year preparing. Dad listened, then said, "Just make sure pride does not keep you from admitting it if this does not work." I remembered that sentence for years. In the beginning, the business did work. Slowly, then surprisingly well. I helped independent retailers improve their online sales and organize inventory systems they had neglected for years. By my second year, I was earning more than I had at my old job. Dad stopped questioning the business, but he never quite praised it either. He simply moved the finish line. "Can you maintain it?" became his new question. So I tried harder. I worked longer. I treated every difficult month as something that had to be hidden until I solved it. I thought success would eventually become undeniable. Then, at 39, several things changed almost at once. Two major clients were acquired by larger companies and ended their contracts. Another reduced its budget. My marriage, which had been quietly strained for years, ended soon afterward. There was no dramatic scene, no single terrible moment, just two people finally admitting that the life they had built no longer fit either of them. Within months, the business I had spent years building was closing, my marriage was over, and I was standing in an apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes, deciding what could fit into my car. I did not call Dad for 3 days. When I finally did, he listened quietly. Then he said, "Come home, Claire. We will figure something out." For one brief second, I felt 10 years old again, relieved that my father was still there. Then he added, "Sometimes you have to accept when a plan did not work." I stared at the boxes around me. There it was again. Not cruelty, not anger. A verdict disguised as advice. And because I had spent nearly 40 years letting my father grade my life, part of me believed him. I drove back to Columbus with everything I still considered mine packed into a 10-year-old Honda Accord. 2 suitcases sat in the back seat. 4 cardboard boxes filled the trunk. My laptop rode beside me like a passenger because it contained the last pieces of a business I had not yet admitted was finished. I had spent years building a life that once required closets, filing cabinets, bookshelves, and an entire home office. Now most of it fit inside one car. The drive from Cincinnati took a little under 2 hours, but I stretched it to nearly 3. I stopped for coffee I did not really want. I sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes watching people walk in and out of the convenience store. Nobody there knew me. Nobody knew I was divorced. Nobody knew my business had collapsed. Nobody knew I was going home at 39 because I had run out of better ideas. There was something comforting about being anonymous for 15 minutes. Mom was waiting in the driveway when I finally turned onto the street where I had grown up. The maple tree Dad planted when Daniel was born was taller than the house now. The basketball hoop was gone, but the faint rectangle where it had been mounted was still visible above the garage. Mom came down the driveway before I had fully stopped the car. "You made good time," she said. She hugged me tightly, then immediately reached for one of the boxes. "Mom, I can carry that." "I know you can." She picked it up anyway. That was Evelyn Bennett. She rarely argued when she could simply keep moving. Dad appeared in the garage wearing an old Ohio State sweatshirt and work gloves. He had been reorganizing shelves, which was something he did whenever he needed an excuse to stay busy. "There she is," he said. He hugged me once, firmly, then stepped back and looked at the car. "This everything I need." His eyes moved toward the boxes in the trunk. Probably good to simplify. I knew what he meant. I also knew what he did not mean. Still, the sentence followed me into the house. My old bedroom had become Mom's sewing room years earlier, so they had cleared out the small guest room at the end of the hallway. There was a full-size bed, a wooden dresser, and a framed watercolor of a lighthouse that had been hanging there since I was in college. Mom had placed fresh towels on the bed and a vase of grocery store flowers on the dresser. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary. "It is only temporary," Dad said behind me. I turned. "I know. I mean that in a good way. I know that too." He nodded as if we had settled something important. That first week, I tried to become invisible. I woke before my parents, made coffee, and spent hours at the dining room table reviewing job listings. I updated my resume until every sentence sounded like it belonged to someone more confident than I felt. I sent applications to marketing firms, retailers, logistics companies, and 2 nonprofit organizations. I answered emails from former clients and closed accounts connected to my old business. Every cancellation felt strangely ordinary. Click. Confirm. Account closed. Years of work disappearing through small digital buttons. Dad watched without appearing to watch. On the 3rd morning, he set his coffee beside my laptop and asked, "How many applications?" 7 so far. Today. This week. He frowned slightly. 7 is not very many. I looked at the screen. I am applying to positions that actually fit my experience. Sometimes you cannot afford to be selective. There was no anger in his voice. That was what made it difficult to challenge. I am not being selective. I am being realistic. Dad pulled out the chair across from me. Claire, realistic would have been keeping the job you had before you started the business. I closed my laptop slowly. That was 5 years ago. I know. Then why are we discussing it? He seemed genuinely confused by the question. Because you are back here. For words. That was all. I looked around the dining room where we had eaten Thanksgiving dinner every year when I was a child. The same oak table. The same brass light fixture. The same father sitting across from me, trying to turn my life into a problem he could solve. I appreciate you letting me stay, I said. Of course we are letting you stay. You are our daughter. Then let me figure out what comes next. Dad leaned back. I am trying to help. I know. And I did know. That was the hardest part. He was not trying to hurt me. In his mind, every question was practical. Every criticism was protection. Every warning was wisdom purchased through experience. But living under his concern felt like standing beneath a ceiling that lowered an inch every day. 2 weeks later, I accepted a temporary position with a regional home goods distributor on the north side of Columbus. The job involved cleaning up product listings, tracking inventory errors, and helping small retail accounts manage online orders. It paid $23 an hour. No title worth bragging about. No corner office. No impressive announcement for Sunday dinner. I took it anyway. When I told Dad, he stared at me for a moment. Temporary. For now. At $23 an hour? Yes. He nodded slowly. Well, something is better than nothing. I smiled because I had learned that defending myself only made his questions multiply. That is what I thought. My first day, I arrived 20 minutes early. The office sat behind a warehouse in a plain industrial park, between a plumbing supplier and a company that rented construction equipment. My desk had one monitor, a gray chair, and a drawer that stuck halfway open. I loved it. Nobody there knew what I had lost. Nobody expected me to explain why I was starting over. They gave me a password, a stack of reports, and a problem to solve. By lunch, I had found 3 duplicate inventory codes that had been causing order errors for months. By Friday, I had reorganized a spreadsheet that everyone else had simply learned to work around. Small things. Useful things. For the first time in months, I drove home tired for a reason that did not feel like defeat. Dad was in the kitchen when I walked in. How was work? He asked. I put my keys on the counter. Good. Think it could turn into something permanent? A week earlier, I would have explained everything I had accomplished. Instead, I opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. Maybe. He waited for more. I gave him nothing. That evening, sitting alone in the guest room, I realized something had changed. My life was still smaller than it had been. My bank account was still uncomfortable to look at. I was still sleeping beneath a lighthouse painting in my parents' house. But for the first time since everything fell apart, I had completed an entire day without asking myself what Dad would think of it. It was only one day. At the time, I did not understand how much that mattered. About a month after I started the temporary job, Dad left an envelope beside my coffee cup. It was a Saturday morning, cold enough that the kitchen windows had fogged at the corners, and Mom was standing at the stove making scrambled eggs. I recognized Dad's handwriting on the front. Claire. Nothing else. What is this? I asked. Open it. Inside was a check for $4,800. I looked at the amount twice before looking at him. Dad, I cannot take this. You can, and you should. He folded the newspaper and placed it beside his plate. It gives you some breathing room. I have money coming in. $23 an hour at a temporary job is not breathing room. Mom turned slightly from the stove, but said nothing. I held the check between my fingers. $4,800 was not a fortune, But at that moment it was enough to cover several months of basic expenses once I moved out. It should have felt generous. Instead, I felt myself becoming careful. Why 4,800? I asked. Dad had an answer ready. Of course he did. 6 months at $800 a month. That should cover most of the rent on a modest place if you find something reasonable. I stared at him. You already looked at apartments? I looked at prices. Where? There are some decent places north of town. Nothing fancy. You do not need fancy right now. Mom set the eggs on the table. Richard. What? Dad asked. I am helping. I put the check back inside the envelope. I appreciate it. Good. But I have not decided where I am going to live. Dad reached for his coffee. That is exactly why you need a plan. There it was. The check was not just money. It was a map. Dad had already drawn the route. Find an inexpensive apartment. Keep the temporary job. Stop taking risks. Rebuild my savings. Eventually apply for something permanent with benefits. From his perspective, it was sensible. Maybe it even was sensible. But I had spent most of my adult life confusing sensible with mandatory whenever the advice came from him. There is a company in Dublin hiring a marketing coordinator, Dad continued. I sent you the listing. I saw it. Good benefits. Established company. I saw that too. You should apply. I looked at the envelope. Maybe. Dad frowned. What does maybe mean? It means maybe. He leaned back. Claire, I do not understand why everything has to be complicated with you. Mom sat down between us. Can we eat before the eggs get cold? We did. Dad talked about Daniel's upcoming promotion review. Mom mentioned a neighbor who had moved to Florida. I kept the envelope beside my plate and said very little. Later that morning, I carried it upstairs and placed it in the top drawer of the guest room dresser. I did not cash the check. I did not tear it up either. For weeks, it stayed there beneath a stack of sweaters. Every time I opened the drawer, I saw the corner of the envelope. It reminded me of something I was only beginning to understand. Dad's help had always come with a picture of what my life should look like afterward. When I was 22, he helped me buy my first car, then spent 2 years questioning every trip he considered unnecessary because I needed to protect the investment. When I got married, he contributed toward the wedding and quietly suggested which guests should be invited. When I started my business, he offered to loan me money if I agreed to let him review my finances each month. I had refused that offer. At the time, I thought I was protecting the business. I did not realize I was protecting myself. The strange thing was that Dad never demanded obedience. He did not have to. Disappointment did most of the work for him. A pause on the phone. A tired sigh. The words, "It is your decision," spoken in a way that made my decision feel foolish before I had even made it. I had spent years adjusting myself around those small reactions. Then something began changing at work. The warehouse manager, a patient man named Marcus Reed, stopped by my desk one afternoon holding a printout covered in yellow highlights. You did this? He asked. The inventory reconciliation? Yes. I reorganized the categories. The old system was counting some online returns twice. Marcus pulled over a chair. We have been trying to figure out why the numbers never matched. I showed him the spreadsheet and explained the problem. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded. Can you do the same thing for our Dayton accounts? Probably. How long? I thought about it. 2 days if the records are clean. For if they are not. He smiled. They are not. I smiled back. Then 4. It took 3. The following week, Marcus asked me to sit in on a meeting with one of their independent retailers, a family-owned kitchen supply store that was losing online orders because its inventory system showed products that were no longer available. I listened while the owner described the problem. Halfway through the meeting, I realized I knew exactly how to fix it. Not theoretically, not eventually. I knew. I had solved variations of the same problem for years. Afterward, Marcus stopped me in the hallway. You are good at this. The words were simple. I almost laughed because of how unfamiliar they felt without a question attached. No comparison. No warning. No condition. Just recognition. Thank you, I said. That evening, Dad was waiting in the living room when I came home. Did you apply for that position in Dublin? He asked. I slipped off my coat. No, his expression tightened. Why not? Because I do not want it. You need something permanent. I looked at him, then toward the staircase. Upstairs, $4,800 was waiting in a drawer. I need something that makes sense for me, I said. Dad sighed. You said that before the last business. Normally, that sentence would have pulled me into an argument. That night, I simply nodded. I remember. Then I walked upstairs. I opened the dresser drawer, took out the envelope, and held it for a moment. For the first time, I understood why I had never deposited the check. Cashing it would have been easy. What I was not willing to accept anymore was the life attached to it. 3 days after I decided not to cash Dad's check, Sarah Collins walked into the warehouse office carrying 2 coffees and a question that changed the direction of my life. I had known Sarah since my first job after college. We had worked together for almost 4 years before our careers went in different directions, but we stayed close enough to exchange birthday messages, meet for lunch whenever we happened to be in the same city, and call each other when something important happened. She knew about my divorce. She knew about the business closing. What she did not know was how small I had begun to feel since coming home. "You look tired," she said, placing a coffee beside my keyboard. "Thank you. You look expensive." She laughed and sat in the empty chair beside my desk. Sarah worked as an operations consultant for several independent retailers around Central Ohio, and she always looked as if she had just stepped out of a meeting where everyone else had forgotten to prepare. "Marcus told me what you did with their inventory records," she said. I looked toward the warehouse door. "Marcus talks too much. He said you found errors they had been carrying for almost a year. It was mostly bad categorization. He said you fixed the Dayton accounts too. They needed the same cleanup." Sarah studied me for a moment. "Why do you keep making everything you do sound accidental?" I looked back at my monitor. "I do not. You just did it twice." I smiled despite myself. "Did you drive all the way over here to criticize me?" "No. I drove over here because I have a client with a problem." She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on my desk. The client was a family-owned home decor store with 2 locations outside Columbus. Their online orders had increased, but their inventory records were a mess. Customers were purchasing products that had already sold in the stores. Staff members were updating multiple systems by hand. Refunds were increasing. Sarah explained all of it while I flipped through the pages. By the time she finished, I could already see where the process was breaking. "They need one inventory source feeding both locations and the website," I said. "Probably. Not probably. They do." Sarah smiled. "There she is." "Who?" "The woman who used to tell me what was wrong with the business before I finished explaining it." I closed the folder. "I am not starting another company. I did not ask you to." "You were about to." "I was going to ask whether you wanted one client." I shook my head. "Sarah, one client, Claire. A small project. You look at the system, recommend changes, help them implement them, and they pay you. I have a job. You have evenings. I also enjoy sleeping. You never enjoyed sleeping." That made me laugh. Sarah leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do." Her expression changed. "What did your old business teach you that somebody would pay you for today?" I did not answer immediately. People had asked me plenty of questions since the business closed. "What happened? How much did you lose? Were there warning signs? Would you do anything differently?" Dad's questions always began with what I should have done. Mine began with what I had done wrong. Sarah's question was different. It assumed the years had left me with something besides regret. I looked down at the folder again. "I know small retailers," I said slowly. "I know where they lose money when inventory and online orders stop matching. I know how employees actually use systems compared with how software companies think they use them. I know how to simplify processes without forcing a store owner to replace everything." Sarah nodded. "Anything else?" "I know how to explain technical problems to people who do not care about technical language." That sounds useful. It is useful. The words came out before I could soften them. Sarah smiled. Exactly. The project paid $600. I almost refused because $600 seemed too small to risk reopening a part of myself I had spent months trying to close. Then I realized I was thinking like Dad. If something was not stable, permanent, and impressive, it did not count. So I said yes. For the next 2 weeks, I worked at the warehouse during the day and spent 3 evenings at the home decor store. I watched employees receive shipments. I followed online orders from purchase to pickup. I asked questions. I took notes. The problem was not complicated once someone bothered to look at the entire process. They were entering the same information in 3 places, and each place updated at a different time. I helped them simplify it. Within a week, the number of inventory mismatches dropped sharply. On the final evening, the owner, a woman named Linda Harper, handed me an envelope. "You saved us more than this," she said. Inside was a check for $600. I sat in my car afterward with the check resting on the passenger seat. $600. I had earned larger checks before. Much larger. But this one felt different. It did not represent a rescue. It did not come with instructions. Nobody had decided what apartment I should rent or which job I should apply for. Someone had a problem. I solved it. They paid me. I took out my phone and photographed the check. My thumb hovered over Dad's name. For years, that would have been the next step. Send proof. Wait for approval. Explain why it mattered. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I deleted the photograph. The next morning, Sarah called. Linda gave your name to another store owner. I stopped halfway through pouring coffee. For what? The same kind of work. I only did one project. Apparently you did it well. Across the kitchen, Dad was reading the newspaper. He looked up when he heard me say, "Yes, I can meet them Thursday." After I ended the call, he folded one corner of the paper. "Job interview?" he asked. I looked at him, then at the coffee in my hand. Something like that. He nodded approvingly and returned to the newspaper. I almost corrected him. Almost. Instead, I carried my coffee upstairs and opened the dresser drawer. Dad's $4,800 check was still there, untouched. I placed my $600 check beside it for a moment. Two pieces of paper. One offered security. The other offered possibility. I knew which one I wanted to earn again. The second client paid me $900, and the third asked whether I could come back every month. That was how it started. Not with a business plan, a rented office, or some dramatic moment when I decided to rebuild everything I had lost. It started with small problems that people were willing to pay me to solve. For the next 3 months, my days became almost painfully ordinary. I arrived at the warehouse before 8 in the morning, worked until 4:30 in the afternoon, drove home through Columbus traffic, ate whatever Mom had saved for me, then opened my laptop at the dining room table. Some nights I worked until 10. Other nights I stopped at 8 because I had learned enough from my first business to know that exhaustion was not proof of commitment. Sarah kept sending people my way. A furniture store in Westerville needed help connecting online orders with warehouse inventory. A specialty food shop in Dublin was losing track of seasonal products. A family-owned hardware store had 3 different spreadsheets maintained by 3 different employees, and none of the numbers matched. I listened. I simplified. I built systems people could actually use. By the end of the 3rd month, I had 3 regular clients. Dad still believed I was doing occasional freelance work after my temporary job. I let him believe it. "You are working too much," Mom said one evening as she placed a bowl of soup beside my laptop. "I am working enough." She looked at the spreadsheets on my screen. "Is this for the warehouse?" "No, one of your side projects." I smiled. "Something like that." Mom touched my shoulder before walking away. She never asked for numbers. That was one of the reasons I eventually told her first. The warehouse offered to extend my temporary position for another 6 months. Marcus called me into his office and said they would increase my pay to $26 an hour. A few months earlier, I would have accepted before he finished speaking. Instead, I asked for the weekend to think about it. On Saturday morning, I drove to a coffee shop near Worthington with a notebook and calculated everything twice. My consulting work had earned just over $6,000 the previous month. It was not guaranteed income. Some invoices came late. Some projects ended. Health insurance would become my responsibility. Taxes would become more complicated. I understood every reason to stay where I was. I could hear Dad listing them without even being in the room. So I did something I had rarely done before. I stopped asking what the safest decision was and asked what the evidence said. The evidence said people kept hiring me. The evidence said they referred other owners to me. The evidence said I had turned down 2 projects because I did not have enough hours left in the week. On Monday, I thanked Marcus and declined the extension. He surprised me by smiling. "I was wondering how long it would take you." "You knew?" "Claire, you spend your lunch breaks taking client calls in your car." I laughed. I thought I was being discreet. "You were not." My last day at the warehouse was a Friday in March. Marcus gave me a coffee mug with the company logo and told me to call if I ever wanted to come back. I put it in the same cardboard box as my notebook and the small plant Mom had bought for my desk. When I carried the box through the front door that evening, Dad looked up from the living room. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." He pointed at the box. "Then why is your desk in our hallway?" "My contract ended." "I thought they offered an extension." I stopped. "They did." Dad stood. "You turned it down?" "Yes." "Why?" I could feel the old reflex returning. "Explain the revenue." Show the numbers. List the clients. Prove the decision was reasonable. Instead, I said, I have other work. Freelance work. Consulting. Dad rubbed his forehead. Claire, we have been through this. No, I have been through this. He stared at me. What is that supposed to mean? It means I know what happened before. I learned from it. Then you should know how quickly clients disappear. His words landed exactly where he intended them to, even if he did not realize it. For a moment, I saw my old office being emptied. I saw closed accounts and cardboard boxes. Then I saw Linda Harper handing me that first $600 check. I know, I said. Dad waited. That is it. That is it. I carried the box upstairs. My hands were shaking slightly when I set it down, but I did not go back downstairs to continue the argument. 6 months later, I had 11 clients. I moved out of my parents' house and rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Worthington. It was 780 square feet, with beige carpet, a narrow balcony, and a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people. I loved every inch of it. Dad came over on moving day and inspected the place with the seriousness of a building inspector. Rent is high for this size, he said. I can afford it. You could save more living with us. I know. He looked at the small desk near the window. This is your office. For now. Dad nodded. Just do not get ahead of yourself. I smiled. I will try. By the following spring, 3 clients had become 11. Then 11 became 27. I rented a small office suite 12 minutes from my apartment and hired my first employee, a 26-year-old operations specialist named Maya Thompson. I did not announce any of it at Sunday dinner. Dad was too busy talking about Daniel, who had just been promoted to vice president at his company. Now that is what patience looks like, Dad said proudly as Mom brought out dessert. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I looked at my coffee. Dad turned to me. How is your little project going? A year earlier, I would have corrected him. I would have told him about the clients, the office, the employee, the revenue. Instead, I took a sip and said, it is keeping me busy. When are you going to get a real job? He asked. Daniel looked at me across the table. I smiled. We will see. Dad nodded, apparently satisfied. My phone buzzed in my purse a few minutes later. It was an email from a regional retail chain asking whether my company could handle 38 of their locations. I read it once beneath the table, locked my phone, and returned to my coffee. Dad kept talking about Daniel's promotion. For the first time in my life, I did not mind being overlooked. The regional chain became our largest client 6 weeks later. 38 stores sounded impossible when I first read the email beneath my parents' dining room table. But by then I had learned that impossible and unfamiliar were not the same thing. Maya and I spent nearly a month mapping their inventory process, testing reports, and building a system that store managers could understand without calling us every morning. When the contract was signed, I sat alone in my office after everyone had gone home and looked at the number on the final page. 2 years earlier, I had been packing my life into a Honda Accord. Now one client was paying my company more in a year than my old temporary job would have paid me in 3. I did not call Dad. That surprised me more than the contract. I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. Tell me you got it. We got it. She screamed loudly enough that I had to move the phone away from my ear. I knew it. You did not know it. I absolutely knew it. I laughed. I was not sure until they signed. That is because you still think certainty has to arrive before confidence. I looked around the office. We had 3 desks now. Maya had convinced me to buy a decent printer. A whiteboard covered one wall, filled with client deadlines and color-coded notes. Nothing about the room was impressive, but everything in it had been earned. Thank you, I said. Sarah became quiet. For what? For asking the right question when everybody else was asking what went wrong. You answered it. That night, I drove home and celebrated with takeout Thai food at my kitchen counter. No champagne. No announcement. No photograph sent to the family group message. I opened my laptop after dinner and reviewed the hiring budget. The regional contract meant Maya could no longer handle operations alone. Within 4 months, we hired 2 more employees. By the end of that year, 27 clients had become 41. I moved the company into a larger office suite with a small conference room and windows overlooking a parking lot lined with maple trees. Dad knew I had an office. He knew I had employees. Somehow, he still treated the whole thing like an extended experiment. How many people work for you now? He asked one Sunday afternoon. 4, including me. Full-time. 3 full-time. He nodded. That is overhead. Yes. Payroll gets expensive. It does. You carrying debt? No. He looked almost disappointed that there was no obvious problem to solve. Well, keep it that way. Daniel was sitting across from us and smiled into his coffee. After Dad went outside to check the grill, Daniel leaned toward me. You enjoy doing that now, do you not? Doing what? Giving him the smallest possible answer. I answer what he asks. You used to give him a presentation. I looked toward the patio door. Dad was adjusting the grill, even though nothing needed adjusting. I got tired of presenting. Daniel nodded. Good. I studied him. You know, I spent years thinking you had it easy with him. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. I spent years making sure he never had a reason to question me. That stopped me. Daniel had the career Dad respected, the house Dad admired, and the title Dad repeated to strangers. I had never considered what it cost him to remain the son who always made sense. Do you like your job? I asked. He looked down at his coffee. Most days. It was not an answer, and for once I did not push. Dad came back inside, and the conversation moved on. Several months later, his 70th birthday approached. Mom reserved a private dining room at one of Dad's favorite restaurants near downtown Columbus. She invited relatives, old friends, former co-workers, and neighbors who had known us since childhood. I offered to help pay for the dinner. Mom accepted. Dad did not know. 3 days before the party, Maya came into my office holding her laptop. You need to see this. An investment and technology company based in Chicago had contacted us twice during the previous month. They specialized in acquiring service businesses that supported retail operations. I had ignored the first message because I assumed it was generic outreach. The second included details about our clients that made it clear they had done their homework. They want a meeting, Maya said. They want to buy something. Probably. Do you want to sell? No, then why meet? I looked at the email. Because I want to know what they think we are worth. The meeting happened the morning before Dad's birthday dinner. 2 executives joined by video. They asked about revenue, retention, staffing, and growth. I answered carefully. They asked whether I would consider selling a controlling interest while staying on to run the company. I told them I would consider an offer. The next afternoon, 3 hours before I was supposed to meet my family at the restaurant, the offer arrived. I was standing in my apartment kitchen when my phone chimed. I opened the document and read the first page, then the second. Then I went back to the first because I thought I had misunderstood the number. $3,200,000 for a controlling share. I sat at the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed behind me. A delivery truck passed outside. Everything looked exactly the same. My coffee was getting cold beside my hand. I should have called someone. Instead, I closed the document and got ready for dinner. I wore a navy blue dress Mom had given me the previous Christmas and drove downtown. By the time I entered the private dining room, Dad was surrounded by friends. He looked happy. I kissed his cheek and handed him a card. There is my wandering entrepreneur, he said with a smile. I smiled back. Happy birthday, Dad. Dinner lasted almost 2 hours before the conversation turned toward work. Dad talked about Daniel's latest promotion. Someone asked what I was doing these days. Melissa answered before I could. Claire has her consulting company. Still doing that? Dad asked, loud enough for the table to hear. I looked at him. Yes. He smiled as if he were teasing. And how is that little business of yours? Are you still failing at it? A few people laughed uncertainly. Melissa immediately looked down. Daniel stopped eating. Mom's hand froze beside her water glass. I could feel my phone inside my purse. $3,200,000 sat in an email less than 3 feet from my father. I could have taken it out. I could have watched his expression change. For most of my life, I would have wanted that moment more than anything. Instead, I placed my fork beside my plate. Maybe, I said. Dad raised his eyebrows. I smiled. But I am not finished. He gave a short laugh and reached for his coffee. Well, that is one way to look at it. I looked around the table and realized I felt no embarrassment at all. Dad believed he had just reduced my life to one word. What he did not understand was that his opinion had finally become the least important number in the room. I did not open the acquisition offer again until the next morning. I woke shortly after 6, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table while Columbus was still gray outside the windows. The number had not changed overnight. $3,200,000 for a controlling share of the company, with a 3-year agreement for me to remain as president. There were pages of conditions, projections, and legal language, But the basic message was simple. Someone believed what I had built was valuable enough to buy. I read the document twice, then called Sarah. "You are awake early," she said. "I have an offer." There was a pause. "What kind of offer?" "The Chicago company." "How much?" I told her. This time she did not scream. "Claire, I know." "What are you going to do?" "I do not know." That was true. $3,200,000 could change my life. Even after taxes and professional fees, it would give me security I had never imagined when I was sleeping in my parents' guest room. I could buy a home outright. I could invest. I could stop worrying about whether one bad year might erase everything again. Sarah asked the question I had been avoiding. "Do you want to sell?" I looked toward the laptop. "I want the money." "That is not what I asked." I smiled. "No, I do not think I want to sell." "Then do not let the number answer for you." Later that morning, I drove to Mom and Dad's house to return a serving dish Mom had sent home with me after the birthday dinner. Dad was in the garage when I arrived. He looked up from a workbench. "You disappeared early last night." "It was almost 10. That is early for your generation." "I am 42, Dad." "Exactly. Young." I laughed and went inside. Mom was putting away groceries. I helped her unload a bag, and for a few minutes we talked about the dinner. She apologized for Dad's comment. "You do not have to apologize for him," I said. "He thinks teasing makes things lighter." "I know what he thinks." She studied my face. "You seem different." "Different how?" "Calmer." Before I could answer, Dad walked into the kitchen carrying his phone. "Claire, what is this?" He held the screen toward me. An old colleague of his had forwarded an article from a local business publication. My company had been mentioned in a short piece about growing service firms in Central Ohio. The article referenced our regional retail contract and recent expansion. Dad read one sentence aloud, then looked at me. 41 clients. Around that. Why did you never tell us? You never asked how many. He stared at me. I ask about your business all the time. You ask when I am getting a real job. Mom suddenly became very interested in arranging apples in a bowl. Dad ignored that. This says you have employees. Yes. And you are working with a 38-store chain? Yes. He sat at the table. I had rarely seen Dad genuinely surprised. What kind of revenue are you doing? I almost laughed. There it was. The question he understood. Numbers. Enough. Enough for what? Enough to pay everyone, pay myself, and keep growing. Dad looked back at the article. That is not a small operation. No, for a moment, I thought he might say he was proud of me. Instead, he asked, "Have you thought about selling?" I froze. Why would you ask that? Because companies like this get acquired all the time. You build value, then somebody bigger buys it. That is how you protect what you have created. I looked at Mom. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything. Dad noticed. What? He asked. Nothing. Claire. I sat across from him. I received an offer yesterday. His expression changed immediately. For the company? A controlling share. How much? I hesitated, then told him. Dad stared at me as if I had switched languages. $3,200,000? Yes. And you are sitting here like this is normal? I am thinking about it. Thinking about it. He pushed his chair back slightly. Claire, there is nothing to think about. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Recognition. There is plenty to think about. You take the offer. Maybe. Not maybe. You take it. He started listing reasons. Market risk. Competition. Economic cycles. Employee costs. The possibility that the company would never be worth this much again. Some of his points were reasonable. That was always Dad's strength. He could wrap control and logic so neatly that disagreement looked irresponsible. You have a chance to lock in your success, he said. Do not make the same mistake twice by believing growth lasts forever. There it was. The old business. The old warning. The old version of me he still carried around as evidence. I stood. I have a meeting with my attorney tomorrow. Good. Have them review the sale. They are reviewing the offer. Same thing. No, Dad. It is not. He looked irritated. Why do you always resist good advice? I picked up my purse. Because advice stops being advice when the person giving it refuses to accept no. The kitchen became quiet. Dad looked at Mom, then back at me. I am trying to protect you. I know. I meant it. But I am not 39 anymore, standing in your guest room with 2 suitcases. His face softened slightly. I never said you were. You do not have to. I kissed Mom's cheek and left. 2 days later, after meetings with my attorney, accountant, Sarah, and Maya, I I sent the Chicago company my answer. I declined the acquisition. I offered to discuss a limited strategic partnership instead, but control of the company was not for sale. I expected panic after I pressed send. Instead, I felt quiet. Dad called that evening. Somehow Mom had told him. You turned it down? He asked. Yes. $3,200,000? Yes. There was a long pause. I hope you know what you were doing. I stood by my apartment window looking at the lights across the parking lot. For most of my life, those words would have terrified me. This time I smiled. So do I, Dad. A year after I turned down the offer from Chicago, Dad asked me a question I had stopped expecting him to ask. Why did you never tell me? We were sitting at the same oak dining table where I had once spent mornings filling out job applications while living in his guest room. Mom had made pot roast for Sunday dinner. Daniel and Melissa had already left, and Mom was in the kitchen wrapping leftovers for me, even though I had told her 3 times that I had food at home. Dad and I were alone at the table with 2 cups of coffee between us. Tell you what, I asked, how well you were doing. I looked at him. He seemed older than he had a year earlier. Not weaker, just quieter. Retirement had finally begun to soften the urgency he once brought to every conversation. I told you I was working. That is not what I mean. He rubbed his thumb along the handle of his coffee mug. Daniel told me you opened another office. We needed more space. He said you have 14 employees now. 15 as of Monday. Dad nodded slowly. The company had grown after I rejected the acquisition. Not magically. Not without difficult months. We lost clients. We made hiring mistakes. One quarter came in below projections and kept me awake more nights than I admitted to anyone. But the strategic partnership I offered the Chicago company instead of selling gave us access to technology and larger accounts without giving away control. By the end of the year, we were working with retailers across 5 states. I bought a small townhouse in Worthington, 10 minutes from my old apartment. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a narrow backyard, and a kitchen with enough room for a table by the window. The first night I slept there, I woke at 3 in the morning and walked downstairs just to remind myself that it was mine. Dad knew about the townhouse. He had helped me hang shelves in the garage. He had checked the furnace, inspected the windows, and informed me that one gutter needed attention before winter. That was still how he loved people. Find the problem. Fix the problem. Move on. So why? He asked again. Why did I not tell you? Yes. I considered giving him an easy answer. I could have said I was busy. I could have said I did not want to talk about work at family dinners. Instead, I stood and walked toward the hallway. Wait here. Dad looked confused. Where would I go? I smiled and went upstairs. My old guest room was still mostly the same. Mom had turned part of it back into storage, but the wooden dresser remained against the wall. I opened the top drawer. The envelope was exactly where I had left it. I had forgotten about it for months at a time, but I had never taken it with me when I moved out. Maybe some part of me knew it belonged here. I carried it downstairs and placed it on the table in front of Dad. He looked at his own handwriting on the front. What is this? Open it. He did. The check for $4,800 was still inside. The date was years old now. Dad stared at it. You never cashed this? No, why not? I sat across from him. Because I realized I did not want the life that came with it. His eyes lifted. What life? The apartment you had already chosen in your head. The permanent job you wanted me to take. The safe decisions you wanted me to make so you would stop worrying. Dad frowned. Claire, that money did not come with conditions. Not written ones. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Mom moved quietly in the kitchen behind us. I knew she could hear every word. I was trying to help you, Dad said. I know. You were struggling. I know that too. Then I do not understand. I touched the edge of the envelope. For years, whenever something good happened, you were the first person I wanted to tell. Do you know why? Dad shook his head. Because I wanted you to approve of it. Not share it. Approve it. I wanted you to tell me whether it counted. He looked down at the check. I never asked you to do that. No, you did not have to. The room stayed quiet. When I got promoted, you asked what Daniel made. When I started my first business, you asked what I would do when it failed. When I started again, you asked when I would get a real job. When someone offered millions for the company, you told me to sell it before you even asked whether I wanted to. Dad leaned back. For once, he did not defend himself immediately. I thought I was protecting you from making mistakes. I know. I watched you lose a business. I watched your marriage end. You came home with everything in one car. I remember. His voice became quieter. I did not want to watch that happen again. For the first time, I heard something beneath all his advice that I had rarely allowed myself to hear. Fear. Not disappointment. Not judgment. Fear. It did not erase the way his words had affected me, but it made them easier to understand. Dad, you cannot protect me from failing without also protecting me from choosing. He stared at the table for several seconds. Then he nodded once. That is probably true. It was not an apology, but from Richard Bennett, it was close enough to make me wait. He looked at me. I was wrong about you. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I had imagined hearing those words for half my life. Now that they were finally there, they felt smaller than I expected. You were wrong about some things, I said. A faint smile crossed his face. Still cannot let me have the last word. Apparently not. He slid the old check back across the table. Keep it. It is worthless now. I know. I picked up the envelope. Then why? Dad looked toward the kitchen, then back at me. Because maybe it is worth remembering. I understood what he meant. I still have that check. Not because it represents the day my father tried to control my future, and not because it proves I succeeded without his money. I keep it because it reminds me of the moment I stopped building a life to prove someone else wrong. For years, I thought success would finally give me the right argument, the right number, the right evidence to place in front of Dad. It never did. Something better happened instead. I stopped needing the argument. I built a life I could call my own, and when my father finally saw it clearly, his approval felt good. It just was not necessary anymore.